This is David Plouffe, Jen O'Malley-Dillon, Quinton Folks, and Stephanie Cutter, all senior staffers on the Kamala Harris campaign. They sat down with Dan Pfeiffer of Pod Save America to discuss why Kamala lost the election.
I think that in a 107-day race, it is very difficult to do all the things you would normally do in a year and a half, 2 years.
We had a Democratic candidate get in 107 days out.
The problem of a 107-day campaign, you have to make decisions in the time frame that we were in.
And you can't even say 107 days. Some of that was spent shoring up the Democratic nomination.
I hate to repeat this over and over, but it was a very short race with a limited number of days.
We've very well established the time frame.
And while we had a lot of resources in a short amount of time,
we had to pick and choose because of the limitations on time.
But we had a limited amount of time.
With a limited amount of time.
107 days.
A limited time window that we had.
So we needed it to be better than that. And perhaps if we had more time, we could have done that.
But the reality is, the more voters saw of Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate, the less they liked her. Just like in 2019.
Hey, Joe, instead of saying no, we can't, let's say yes, we can.
Despite the fact that everyone knew who she was, nobody wanted her, Kamala's senior staffers were claiming that they were basically starting from scratch.
They saw in the vice president someone they didn't know a lot about a background. So, who she was, what she stood for, what she did as vice president.
We were defining someone who was wholly undefined from the start.
People don't know her. They need to know more about who she is, what she stands for.
She was the incumbent, but she really wasn't the incumbent. People didn't know that much about her. Either people didn't know about her, or what they did know about her was based off of negative media.
Oh, you see, the American public didn't really know Kamala. And what they did know about her, they didn't like because it was the media's fault. Got it. But even though Trump had a higher favorability rating, Kamala Harris was consistently polling ahead of Trump in presidential polls, which never made a lot of sense, and now we know why.
Public polls that came out in late September, early October, showing us with leads that we never saw. It was just basically a race that in the battlegrounds was 46-47, 47-48. So that's not where we started. We started behind. She was able to climb out. I think even after the debate, we might have gained, 0.51? It wasn't a race that moved a lot.
So what David Plouffe is saying is that unlike the public polls, their internal polls never showed Kamala ahead. And when asked about it on CNN, he claimed the opposite.
But I think our data is consistent with what the public data is. Obviously, a campaign like ours has a lot of sophisticated data. We look at this every day. We do quantitative research, qualitative research. But as we look at how 100% of the vote's going to get allocated in these 7 battleground states, we think we have an advantage over the Trump campaign.
In other words, he lied. I know you're shocked. Now remember, the campaign claims that they needed to reintroduce their candidate to the electorate. Yet it took Kamala Harris 39 days to finally sit down for an interview, and it was a softball interview at that, which she did alongside Tim Walz.
When I look at the aspirations, the goals, the ambitions of the American people, I think that people are ready for a new way forward.
Then, with only 51 days before the election, Kamala Harris finally did her first solo interview, where she was asked why Americans should vote for her.
Well, if you are hardworking, if you have the dreams and the ambitions and the aspirations of what I believe you do, you're in my plan. All Americans, wherever they start, wherever they are, have the ability to actually achieve those dreams and those ambitions. We have ambition. We have aspirations. We have dreams.
Good grief. The truth is that Kamala is notoriously bad at interviews, which is why the campaign limited her access.
Do you have any plans to visit the border?
I'm here in Guatemala today. At some point, we are going to the border. We've been to the border. So this whole thing about the border, we've been to the border. We've been to the border.
You haven't been to the border.
And I haven't been to Europe. And I don't
So instead of being honest and addressing the fact that the campaign didn't schedule Kamala to do interviews for the entire first half of her campaign, her staffers complained that the media was being harder on Kamala for not doing interviews than they were on Trump.
Real people heard in some way that we were not going to have interviews, which was both not true and also so counter to any kind of standard that was put on Trump that I think that was a problem. But being up against a narrative that we weren't doing anything or we were afraid to have interviews is completely bullshit, and also like took hold a little bit, and we just gave us another thing we had to fight back for that Trump never had to worry about. Trump
We
got no shit.
so we got tons of that she wasn't doing enough media, but voters don't give a shit.
And not only did they complain about the media not being tough enough on Trump, but they also complained about the type of questions that the media was asking Kamala.
And then on top of that, we would do an interview, and to Stephanie's point, the questions were small and processy and about like
Dumb.
They were not informing a voter who was trying to listen to learn more.
So instead of taking any responsibility for terrible interview prep or admitting that Kamala was just the worst, the campaign blamed the media and their dumb questions. You can't make this stuff up, folks. And speaking of interviews, one of the biggest blunders of the 2024 cycle was the abject failure to schedule Kamala Harris to appear on the Joe Rogan Experience. And Kamala's campaign? Well, it wasn't their fault.
Yeah, there's a lot of intrigue around this, a lot of theories. It's pretty simple. We wanted to do it, and for a candidate to leave the battleground to go to Houston, which is a day off the playing field in the battleground, getting that timing right is really important.
First of all, Joe Rogan is in Austin, which is 165 miles from Houston, but that's beside the point. Stephanie Cutter is saying that going to Houston, Texas to record Joe Rogan would have taken her out of a battleground state, but then points out that they did an event in Houston, Texas.
We did go to Houston, and she gave a great speech at an amazing event.
The Beyonce event?
I'm going to call it reproductive freedom.
So Dan Pfeiffer called the October 25th campaign rally the Beyonce event. And Stephanie Cutter was like, no, it was the reproductive freedom event. But the reality is that Dan Pfeiffer is right. Beyonce not only overshadowed the event, but she was the main reason that anyone tuned in, because they were told that Beyonce was going to perform. The big news story of the day wasn't about Kamala giving a speech about freedom. The story was that Beyonce didn't perform at the rally and how everyone was pissed off about it.
She was ready, willing to go on Joe Rogan. Would it have changed anything? It would have been it would have broken through, not because of the conversation with Joe Rogan, but because the fact that she was doing it. But it, didn't ultimately impact the outcome one way or the other.
Keep telling yourself that, honey.
But I do also want to say that Tim Walz was a huge podcaster and was on podcasts all the time.
Wow, whoop-de sh**.
Again, it can sound like making excuses. This political environment sucked, okay? We were dealing with ferocious headwinds. You have a race where you've got the current incumbent president with approval ratings of, let's say, 38 to 40. And I think people's instinct was to give the Republicans and even Donald Trump another chance.
Probably the only honest statement of the interview. Before Biden was forced out of the race, his disapproval rating was at historic lows, and 70% of registered voters believed that the country was on the wrong track. And the Democrats thought that the best person to replace the incumbent president was the incumbent vice president.
Too many people thought that she'd be a continuation, which on the economy was, the incumbent killer. We knew we had to show her as her own person and point to the future and not try to rehash the past. She felt like she was part of the administration, so why should she look back and cherry pick some things that she would have done differently when she was part of it? And unless we said something like, well, I would have handled the border completely differently, we were never going to satisfy anybody.
So the campaign wanted to convince voters that Kamala would be a new way forward, but couldn't name a single thing that she would have done differently.
If anything, would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact.
But the way that Stephanie Cutter describes it, not answering this question was a strategy.
Imagine if we said, well, we would have taken this approach on the border. Imagine the round of stories coming out after that of people saying, well, she never said that in a meeting, or what meeting when she said this, or I remember when she did that. And it wasn't going to give us what we needed because it wouldn't be a clean break.
In other words, if Kamala said that she would have done things differently, it would have been a lie. And there would have been leaks from the White House, and because people just don't like her.
All of these things, we were trying to tell a story and give the impression that she was different without pointing to a specific issue.
So in telling Kamala's story, they basically skipped over her tenure as vice president, because that would have just reminded people that she was the vice president. So instead, they talked about everything else.
We did a lot of stuff about her record as AG, her record as a prosecutor, not as vice president, because it also allowed her to stand alone separate from the Biden administration.
Imagine being such a failure as vice president that you had to avoid talking about it. Sad, really. Next, Kamala's senior staffers spoke about two of the biggest ads put out by the Trump campaign.
I mean, the most effective ad, Quentin, I think they ran was the Bidenomics ad.
Everyday prices are too high. Food, rent, gas, back to school clothes. That is called Bidenomics. A loaf of bread costs 50% more today. Ground beef is up almost 50%. There's not much left at the end of the month. Bidenomics is working. The price of housing has gone up. It feels so hard to just be able to get ahead. And we are very proud of Bidenomics.
That was kind of core to people's concern. It was like, well, maybe you're not change. You're defending an economic program that I don't think's helped me.
And while that was a very effective ad, the next was arguably the most problematic for the campaign.
Surgery.
For prisoners.
For prisoners. Every transgender inmate in the prison system would have access.
It's hard to believe, but it's true. Even the liberal media was shocked Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners and illegal aliens.
And I think that the way in which they targeted this ad, they were trying to, I think, make our job harder with black voters. I think that Trump and them weren't using this ad to move vote share as much. This sort of earned echo chamber around these things can have much more of an impact on them than the money that's put behind them.
And I mean, where we saw the first indication of what Quentin is talking about is when Charlemagne started talking about it.
Yeah.
That ad they was running during the football games this weekend claiming the vice president supports funding gender transition surgeries for all prison inmates and migrants in the U.S., that was nuts. I don't know if it was the backdrop of football, but when you hear the narrator say Kamala supports taxpayer-funded sex changes for prisoners, that one line, I was like, hell no, I don't want my taxpayer dollars going to that. That ad was effective. That ad was impactful.
And that was when, we clued in that, okay, so their strategy isn't to pull in new voters to them, it's to mess with us.
And this ad was a major problem for the campaign because they could not figure out how to effectively get in front of it.
So if we could have just said, that's a lie. It's not anything she's ever believed. She was on tape. Surgery for for people who want to transition in prison was part of the Biden-Harris platform in 2020.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to deny something that is literally a section of the party's 2020 platform and also included in the Democrats' 2024 platform. So the campaign couldn't lie and say that Kamala doesn't believe in that stuff anymore. So instead, they tried another tactic.
And that's when we had been doing the research to try to figure out what the actual policy was, where does this come from, and discovered that it was the Trump policy also, and tried to push that out there. The New York Times wrote about it. We tried to force a discussion on it. It didn't ultimately get going.
Yeah, because it was a lie. Trying to convince voters that Trump was advocating for taxpayer-funded sex change operations for federal prisoners, it was a non-starter.
Kamala's for they, them. President Trump is for you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
So if you were looking for accountability or self-reflection or any honest self-awareness from Kamala's campaign staff, well, you won't find that here. Instead, all you're gonna get is revisionist history.
And I think the vice president, to her credit, was exceptional at this at every turn during this campaign. Very clear on her vision, very clear on who she was, very clear on the issues that she understood people cared about, and really how to do something about it. And I think that really broke through.
Delusional to the very end. Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time, if there is a next time.